even as I'm recording all of this, that it's just absolutely astonishing. Uh, this this chapter here is going to focus on the likely outcome of being ordered into isolation. And what's fascinating and also frightening about this outbreak is how everything that we're seeing in Liberia and Sierra Leone is really a roadmap for what's coming in the United States or Spain, even, or Europe, or other countries where this outbreak is very likely to end up. Now, since I recorded the last chapter, the Washington Post did a really fascinating story called "The Ominous Math of the Ebola Epidemic." And in this story, they talk about how every one infection is leading to an additional 1.5 to 2.0 new infections. So this is doubling, the number of infections are doubling about every 3 to 4 weeks. It doesn't take long for that to explode completely beyond any ability of any world government or medical system to keep up with it. And in fact, the Washington Post talks about how desperately we need to have people in hospitals and treatment centers, and yet there simply aren't enough beds. For example, they say that to halt the transmission of the disease, you need to have about 70% of infected people in treatment centers. And right now, there's only about 18% of infected people in treatment centers. And then a month from now, they estimate that we're going to need 45,000 to 50,000 people in treatment centers. And in 2 months, that's going to be 100,000 people. And in 3 months, that's going to be 200,000 people, and so on. And now, how many beds are there in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea? Um, just a few hundred, really, and many of the doctors and nurses and medical staff have fled. This is also happening in Spain, where the nurses and doctors are now resigning en masse because they do not want to treat possible Ebola patients who came into close contact with that nurse who died there from Ebola after acquiring it from a missionary. So what we're seeing is the collapse of the medical system at the same time that mathematically we need to be seeing really we need a medical system that is 100 times larger than it is today in terms of number of people, staffers, uh, number of treatment beds and centers, and it's just not happening. It's just not happening. So mathematically, it is almost impossible to see how this can be contained without some kind of intervention that really turns the tide on this thing. And the real concern right now is that this is going to become a global endemic disease that burns through populations everywhere, continuing without end, kind of like AIDS, but with a far, far higher fatality rate. AIDS is child's play compared to Ebola. So mathematically, even the experts can't see a scenario where this gets controlled in any kind of easy solution or quick solution. There is no circumstance that is on the drawing board, so to speak, that could solve this problem. In fact, the Washington Post quotes the president of Sierra Leone saying the country desperately needs 750 doctors, 3,000 nurses, 1,500 hygienists, counselors, and nutritionists, and those people aren't coming. They just aren't coming, and the number of infections is doubling every 30 days, roughly. So it is very difficult to see any kind of a scenario in which this is controlled or brought under control. Transmission is halted. And I recently wrote a story warning about the effects of that. Ultimately, you've got to realize that this is going to get into South America. And if it gets into South America, I very much doubt that the governments of many of those nations in South America can keep a lid on this outbreak. So you're likely to have an exploding outbreak throughout South, perhaps Central America, and that could lead to a massive influx of infected patients heading north into the border.
Obviously, this was made right before the outbreak in the United States, so but it's still good listening here.
Of the United States. thereby infecting people in America and eventually Canada as well. So it's very difficult to see how this could possibly be controlled. Now, in Liberia, the situation has become so bad that the state is turning to some rather desperate measures to attempt to bring this under control. And right now, Liberian lawmakers are debating whether to grant the president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, extraordinary police state powers that would give her the ability to ban all public gatherings for any reason whatsoever. I'm going to read you this article, well, a few paragraphs from it out of Newsday. It would allow the president to limit the right to assembly for any reason. That's a quote. And right now, the government is in a 3-month state of emergency that began really 2 months ago, so it's continuing another month. These new proposals drew heavy protests. A headline in the newspaper in Liberia said, called it, quote, tyrannical times or Ebola preventive measures. And one lawmaker said, quote, I see a kind of police state creeping in, and that is precisely it. Another person said this is tantamount to dictatorship. The police brutalize people who are from the student community. There's a lot of concern about the police powers in all of this. Now, the reason this is important is because this is exactly what's going to happen in the United States if this outbreak continues. You're going to have the suspension of all civil rights, and you're going to have the declaration of medical martial law, a medical police state. And there's already talk out there of people being issued vaccine ID cards and having to consent to mandatory Ebola vaccines and to be able to show that card at checkpoints, which could be established, or to be able to travel, to be able to cash a check, to be able to essentially do anything in public whatsoever, maybe even to vote. So they will strip you of all rights unless you have this vaccine ID card. Now, there's no proof that that is the case yet. That's conjecture, but there's talk of that happening, and it seems like it's a logical extrapolation of the direction in which this is going. You've got governments turning to more and more desperate measures, more police state measures to control the population in order to try to stop the transmission of Ebola. So there's no telling what could be invoked in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, or South America, or other nations if this continues to spread far outside of Africa. So be ready for it. Now, the real focus of this episode, this chapter, is about the coming mandatory isolation orders. If Ebola begins to really spread in the United States, or whatever country that you are in, it is very likely that at some point the population will be ordered into self-isolation, which means that you'll be ordered to stay home, to not come out at all. You can't go to the grocery store. You can't gather in groups. You can't go to work. You can't go into a city bus or a subway or any form of public transportation. You can't gather for any reason whatsoever. Everyone would be ordered to stay home and isolate themselves for some period of time while the government attempts to break the chain of transmission, which might be completely impossible to do. But they're likely to try this anyway. Now, if you're ordered into this state of isolation, a couple of questions should come to mind. Number one, do you have the supplies to be able to survive a mandatory isolation order? In other words, do you have food, water, medicine, power, communications, heating or cooling, or alternatives to that? Do you have the ability to protect your family, your household? Do you have the ability to care for yourself, your pets, family members, whatever is needed? And then the second question immediately after that is, how long? How long could this last? In Liberia, there was already a 3-day mandatory isolation ordered. But that was just the first. There could be much, much longer durations ordered based on how desperate the government has become over the outbreak. It's not difficult to imagine people being ordered into isolation for a period of weeks in a really bad outbreak scenario. Or perhaps this would be regionally ordered. So if there's an outbreak in your particular city, and for this example, let's pick San Diego, just because we pick random cities for examples here. But let's say San Diego is under quarantine. It could be that people who live in San Diego would be ordered to stay in their homes for a rather uncomfortably long period of time. It could be an extended self-isolation order, or what they might call shelter in place. Now, most households are not able to support themselves for any extended period of time, certainly not for a period of many, many weeks. So it makes you wonder if this could even fly at all. But I was asked the question just yesterday. Someone was asking me about, well, who are the FEMA camps for? And all these quarantine camps. And there's a lot of talk about FEMA camps out there, and even talk about FEMA coffins and cremation ovens and things like that. But in my view, in my assessment of the situation, FEMA is not going to be coming after you if you're in your own home, you're isolated in your own home. They probably are going to have their hands full just with people who are running around the streets. So you're more likely to get arrested or detained or quarantined if you're on the street, or you're involved in a looting mission of, I don't know, a Walmart or something. Say you and your buddies go out at night and you try to loot the local Walmart. You might be surprised to find half the cops in there doing it first, but nevertheless, or maybe it's already been looted, there's nothing left. But if you are caught out in the open, that's when you're likely to be arrested, detained, quarantined. If you just stay home, I don't think that there's an extremely high risk. I don't think FEMA can go door to door and grab everybody out of their homes and take them away somewhere, because they just don't have the facilities to do that. They physically don't have the space, nor, I think, the manpower to do that. Now, I've heard some people say, well, they could use football stadiums and they could use large facilities that are available out there, and they could relocate a lot of people. Well, they could for some limited number, but they could not house millions of people like you have in cities like San Diego or Los Angeles or New York City and so on. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about being, taken out of your home and, quote, rounded up and taken to a FEMA camp. If you can stay home and stay in isolation and take care of yourself and your family, you're probably going to avoid most of the efforts of the authorities, who are out there really mostly trying to keep the peace and trying to detain people who look like they're infectious. So, again, the number one targets are going to be people running around the streets, mostly at night probably, or people who become symptomatic in public. So if you're at the local bank and you start vomiting up blood, then obviously someone's going to call the authorities, and you're probably going to be quarantined in a non-level 4 biohazard facility. In other words, a facility that's not equipped for level 4 biohazards, which Ebola is. And you could very quickly find yourself in quarantine with a bunch of people who are possibly even sicker than you are. And that's not a good scenario. So this is why, again, it's very, very important to be able to stay home, to be able to ride out any kind of an isolation order, and stay healthy by making sure that you don't catch Ebola. Overall, it's very clear that isolation is the answer to stopping Ebola. Now, perhaps maybe there'll be a miracle drug or a miracle vaccine or something that does actually work instead of like flu vaccines, which don't. So maybe there'll be some medical miracle that comes along, but I wouldn't bet my life on that. Societies are going to need to practice a lot of isolation, and then, of course, those individuals who want to boost their immune function with natural remedies or natural immune supporting substances, they're the ones who are going to be most likely to survive. But isolation, you're going to see that across the board.